Thank you, everybody, for being here. I'm Johanna Rothman, and on behalf of the Agile Alliance and Retrium, let me welcome you to this webinar. I'm reading the name of the webinar so I get it right. Successfully Distributed, How to Thrive as a Remote Agile Team. We're all remote now, and a bunch of us are gonna stay remote for the foreseeable future. And up until March, when I asked people about their remote experience, I got the big eye roll. Oh, remote. You can't do that with Agile, right? All that stuff. So now, when I ask people, they say, they give me that funny look and the funny wells and hums. They have a lot of questions about how to succeed and thrive. So with the Agile Alliance and Retrium, we've gathered this panel of experts, and each of whom has a ton of experience with creating a great environment for remote work. I'm going to ask them to introduce themselves, and Stella, I'm going to start with you.
All right. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, good night. I don't know. Hello from Chicago. I'm Stella Garber, and currently I run marketing for Trello. I've been remote or working remotely for at least the last 10 years, and the last 6 have been leading marketing for Trello. I'm curious if folks want to put in the chat if you use Trello and what you use it for. I always love to hear that. But Trello itself was a remotely distributed company. We were about 80% remote with an office in New York when Atlassian bought us a few years ago. And it's been interesting because Atlassian has offices all over the world, and everyone has gone remote. So the folks at Trello, we've been helping our Atlassian teammates also go remote. But I have a lot of experience leading a team and creating culture, and I'm excited to chat with everyone today.
Thank you. And Mike, would you go next, please?
Certainly. I've been at Sonatype for 8.5 years. When I started, they had already created a remote environment. It was a lot smaller then. I think there were about 12 people in engineering. Now we're getting close to 160 to 200, depending on how you look at it, and all the different disciplines involved. So I run engineering and product development generally. Yeah, over the years, I've seen a lot of people, including some folks within Sonatype, question, can you really do all this stuff remote? Are you guys going to be as effective? And the answer is absolutely.
Thank you. David, you're next.
Thanks, Joanna. So I'm David Horowitz. I'm the Retrium CEO and co-founder. I've been working fully remote here at Retrium for over 5 years, and before that for the World Bank, where of course we had distributed teams as well, given the title of the organization. So I've been doing this for well over a decade at this point in varying capacities. And within Retrium itself, it's been an interesting experience because of course we built the product to help teams run better retrospectives when you're distributed. And for a while people thought, oh, that's nice. And then this situation hit, and now it's become kind of a need to make things work for Agile teams. So excited to be here and to talk with all of you.
Thank you. And Marcus, bring us home.
Good afternoon. I'm calling in from Germany, near Munich here today. And yeah, I work for Buffer. I'm an engineering manager there. Buffer is a 90-person team. We've been remote for basically all its existence. I've worked remotely for all my professional life. We don't have an office, and we're really distributed across the world. I'm leading a team, I said it before, that's distributed from Taiwan over to the West Coast and in the middle. So challenging by times, but also interesting. And yeah, I'm since the last 3.5 years, I'm really looking into this people management side of managing teams remotely and like really going deep also in the async part. So I'm writing and speaking about that a lot. I'm also trying to finish a book. So yeah, this is definitely a topic that's near to my heart.
Excellent. So let's get into some of the questions and comments. And there was an email exchange that Erica, who is our support person, but that does not really explain what she does. She's supporting this webinar, but she's much more than just support. Got this interesting email exchange with a person from New Zealand. And it says, New Zealand's new route is almost back to normal, meaning back to work in the office, loads of hand sanitizer and 1 meter social distancing, as we only have 21 active cases in New Zealand. However, we now have a culture of work at home for focus, work in the office for collaboration. And I would like to get some comments from some of you about this business of focus versus collaboration. Does it make sense to separate it? How much time do you want to use to separate? Let's go.
So I'll start. It's interesting to hear the dichotomy there. Of course, being in the US, our experience is unfortunately very different from what you have in New Zealand, but I have 4 little kids. I was just talking about this with the panelists before we went live, all under the age of 8. And so for me personally, at least, work from home used to be a way to focus and is currently a way to unfocus from what I need to be doing at work. And collaboration tends to happen now when I'm out on a walk in the woods, for example, on my phone with my team, but away from home where there's a lot of distraction that I need to be focused on in a different way to support my family. So my experience personally in the crisis has been quite different given what's going on here in the US.
Well, I'll jump in. I think I like to caveat of doing a lot of these remote work panels these days that we're not experiencing normal remote work right now. And I think it's really, really important to caveat that, especially for the folks who are experiencing remote work for the first time. Usually you have childcare during remote work. Usually you can focus during remote work. Usually you're not dealing with all the stress that comes from living in a global pandemic and dealing with sick, people around you. So all of that aside, I remember seeing a tweet fairly early on that said something like, this isn't remote work. This is trying to survive a global pandemic while working without childcare. So that's one thing to keep in mind. So I feel like, and in my experience, I always find it funny when people are talking about remote work as like people are gonna watch Netflix and do their laundry, because in my experience, it's the people in the office who tend to not get a lot of actual work done because there's a lot of social, stuff going on. And I'm a very social person. So when I'm in an office setting, I'm just, chit chat with everybody. And then what ends up happening is I bring my actual work home and I end up working very late and horrible hours and having horrible work-life balance, which I think is a very common thing, at least in the United States. So in my experience, what I love about remote work is being able to control your environment, being able to really optimize your time and your environment to work for you and to really focus on your own productivity. And what I always really love is my team. We are globally distributed, but we get together a few times a year for offsites. And that's the time that we use to really generate great creative ideas and bond as a team. And then we go back and we execute individually, or not individually, but we execute, at home, working remotely and collaborating digitally.
So one thing that struck me, Johanna, when you mentioned that initially, is that remote is for focus, and in office is for collaboration. We can't do that, right? My team is spread all around the world, but I think it comes down to a lot of things can be done asynchronously when you're remote, but some things need to be synchronous. And if you only waited for the synchronous interactions when you were in the office, you'd have a real problem. And I think what you want to do is like anything, it's a complex situation. The best way to approach it is through continuous learning and continuous improvement. And a lot of people have been forced into this and they've had to improve right out of the gate without a doubt. But I think you have to stop and you say, how do you take advantage of the new benefits of the remote environment, but at the same time compensate for what you lose? In our particular case, we still get together, not in the current global pandemic, but soon, hopefully, we'll get together. And I think, as Stella mentioned, there's a high bandwidth exchange that you get when you're face to face. You don't always need that. You only need it some of the time. And some of the time you desperately need it, especially if it's a really tough, thorny product or project where there's a lot of creativity required and maybe other tensions and pressures on the team, it's great to get together without a doubt. But it's amazing how much you can do without actually having to get together. It's part of that.
I don't want to add too much because there was said a lot, but I think there's also a silver lining in there, which looking also in Germany at the companies here, like if we would go to this model where at least we have a certain amount of working from home, I think that's already a big improvement for a lot of people. So not even looking at the differentiation of what's going to happen where, but already that, you know, a company that was supposed to be just, you know, co-located now is offering half the time at home. Like this is, for me personally, being in this space, quite a big improvement. So like looking at it from like a bigger picture.
Okay, so let me go on to the next question. And there's, what approaches have you tried around ensuring a team doesn't lose their collaborative culture? And the second part of that is, how about ideas around those water cooler moments that happen?
So one of the things that we did early on, and again, 8.5 years ago, very few companies had done this. I think GitHub was fully remote, and there were a few others out there. It wasn't very well known, but we tried to create similar conditions to what you had in a co-located context virtually. We weren't using Slack at the time, we do now, but we had rooms specifically targeted sometimes for mostly serious conversation, like the engineering channel, but I say mostly serious because you never know when somebody drops something hysterical in there. But and then, you know, the completely random channels, we have something that we call the lounge. I can't take credit for that name. I think Atlassian maybe wrote about that at one point, but maybe it was actually Trello before Atlassian acquired them. But I think a key point is, you know, and getting back to the crux of the question in the collaborative culture, is you have to remember that a lot more needs to be written down when you're remote. And arguably, you should have probably written it down even when you were in the office, because just because some conversation happened at the water cooler doesn't mean everybody that needs to know that information got that information. So I think that's one of these things that I think the world has forever changed as a result of the pandemic. It's opening, you know, in the knowledge work context, opening people's eyes to the fact that, yeah, there could be a different way. And, you know, I think the combination of an effective, you know, co-location and remote is going to be really interesting as we go forward.
Mike, do you want to talk a little bit more about that back channel that you referred to? So for all of you who are on the listening right now, the first question David asked when we were all getting together is, what is our back channel? And Mike, I think that you guys at Sonatype, I don't know about Buffer and Trello or Atlassian. I think that you guys at Sonatype make excellent use of your various back channels. So do you want to talk about that for a second?
Are you just talking about things like you know, Confluence and other, you know, collaborative tools for papering and writing down, or you? I missed the context.
Oh, sorry. I was thinking specifically about the chat back channel, because I know
I'd
that.
like to chime in. That
Oh,
I think we actually
fine.
have written a bunch about that.
Okay.
We have so we at Trello have always, we believe in, you know, bringing your full self to work. And I think Buffer has written a lot about that as well. And so remotely, that's all about being able to share with your team about your kids and the celebrity gossip and what you did over the weekend. It's, people are people. And just because they're working from home doesn't mean that they don't want to hear about and share photos. And I think that one thing that's so amazing right now is that technology has gotten so much better. You know, you now Zoom, we have Zoom, and it's not like, which is what it was, you know, 10 years ago when I first started working remotely. And when Slack, you have all of the GIFs and ability to share photos and videos and things like that. So creating if you're in a leadership position, it's really important to recognize those things and create those channels where people can be fully expressive. So I'll give a couple more examples. At Trello, we have cooking channels, we have music channels, we have dog channels, we have cat channels, we have our kids channels where parents are sharing advice and asking questions. We've got a book club. I mean, I can go on and on and on. And the wonderful thing about it is that not everybody has to participate in everything, and you can sort of choose and find your community the same way that you would do in an office. And I would say that regardless of the size of the company, we did this when we were 10 people. We're doing it now when we're over 5,000 people. So it's just really important to recognize sort of the humanity in people. And that also creates those relationships between people that transcend transactional interactions, where it becomes much more relational and they see each other as people. And that's really, really important for both for collaboration, but also for people to feel happy at work.
Yeah, I think one thing that I always try to mention with like the water cooler and those moments is one word for me that encapsulates that a lot is being intentional when you work remotely. Like you have to, it just doesn't happen. You have to make it happen. You have to be intentional about it. And we have also all the various channels. We even have a water cooler channel. And one thing that I always like, we've started to not use it that much anymore, is a bot called Donut in Slack, which just connects you with a random person every week if you wanted to. And to see if you want to hop on a call or just chat in Slack for like 10 minutes or so. Just trying to recreate those serendipitous moments that would happen in an office.
Well, an interesting thing happened over the years. When we started out, we didn't get together that often, but back in, I think, 2013 was the first time we did our, product meetup. It was very small. We brought a few other groups outside of the product and engineering organization in, but I think it was 35 people. But as we continue to grow, I was involved in the recruiting process all along. But the interesting thing is when I got a chance to finally meet people in person, it didn't feel like I had never met them in person before. And I think that is indicative of the fact that you kind of made it work right. You had sufficient social interaction. You probably used, video communication along the way, but it's been amazing to me. But there's also been some kind of funny moments. There was one gentleman who, the way he had his camera set up, made him look very small and frail and little. And he came in and he was about 6'7".
Yes.
And everybody was like, "Who is this guy?"
That's
pretty funny. But
those moments are. I still have this one moment where I had exact the same thing with one person, and they were exactly the opposite of what you expect.
I really like that. So let me go on to another question. We have a multicultural team with some strong personalities and some shy people. How do we create a safe space for everyone to contribute even while remote?
I'll start there. So you always have a mix of personalities on every team. Some people will be more shy than others, for example. And so the mode of communication should be flexible to enable people with different personality types to feel comfortable contributing to the conversation. So a practical example of that. Some people will feel very comfortable in a large group setting. They see their team is there and they feel very comfortable speaking in front of that group synchronously. Other people might feel comfortable in a synchronous setting, but in a smaller one-to-one type conversation. So if instead of having a full team conversation all the time, you do breakout rooms, and on Zoom, for example, you can do that, and other products as well, you can enable people to speak just one-on-one. Some people will find comfort there. Other people don't feel comfortable as much in any sort of synchronous live conversation mode and would feel much more comfortable with asynchronous conversation. And so to enable them to communicate in a way that they feel comfortable is important. And I think, Mike, you mentioned adding in additional asynchronous conversation into a remote team matters. And I agree with you very strongly there, that the more you can do asynchronously, the better off you are. If nothing else, then to enable people to feel comfortable adding their voice to the conversation in varying ways.
I think this is a complex problem for sure. I mean, the team dynamics are interesting. We had some of these challenges as well. And what we did, and I have to credit one of our Agile coaches, Matt Phillips, I think it was, we found a team where the imbalance was most prevalent. And he went in, and I don't know exactly how he did it, but he basically listened to the meeting and he recorded everybody who talked and which direction the conversation was flowing. So he visualized the conversation. And then after, and I'm sure you can find it somewhere on the internet, how somebody's done that. But then he shared that information with the team, and then he just asked them. He said, "Is this the most effective way?" And you had some really dominant personalities, and it was a very good team overall. We had the right people with the right core skill sets and the right personalities. They just didn't even realize they were doing it. But once you visualize it, and then the team understands how things are going, those strong voices will start to probe and soften up a little bit, or at least that's what we saw. And I thought it was neat to start with kind of that difficult situation, and then it started spreading more broadly.
Yeah, I think Oh, Stella, go.
Go ahead.
General understanding, I think, is good. I have the same problem now with my team being so spread, and I think there's a good book I can recommend. It's called The Culture Map, which kind of explains that in a very nice way of like what's a high context culture, low context culture, and then kind of giving the people the understanding of like, okay, you're working with people from different cultures, right? And I think that's starting to help to just, make that more transparent. And one thing that David said also reminded me, if you have people that are maybe more shy or like a different way, we have a setting in our Slack profile where you can or have to say how you like to get feedback. Do you want it written? Do you want it video? Do you want it written and then video? Just so in case you need to give that person feedback or need to, talk to them, what their way of like approach is. So that's definitely helpful.
One other thing I'd recommend, we have, I work in marketing, so we are a highly, highly collaborative team with a lot of different personalities. And one thing that we've done is we've done some team building activities where we look at different personality types and how they communicate and how the environments that they thrive in. And it was very eye-opening for everyone on the team, just how different people's preferences were. So having that, obviously that wasn't like a company-wide thing. It was like a team limited to, I think at the time we were like 15 people, but we had a facilitator do that. And then we took that and we put it on a Trello board that said, for any time a new team member joined, they could see sort of what the personality types were of the folks on their team. And it's something, we did it a couple of years ago, and it's something I still think about to this day. For example, we had a person on the team who it came out that they didn't love having the questions on the spot, like being put on the spot. And so I know now that anytime I have a one-on-one or meeting with that individual, I try to send them a bunch of questions ahead of time so that they can think about it, versus some other people who I know are more comfortable with just answering questions on the fly.
I got to build on that, Stella, because you mentioned something really interesting, which is documenting something important to your team, which was personality differences. And adding it back in a bit of documentation as your level of remote increases makes sense. So for us, trying to figure out what is core to how we operate as a company that we need to document, and always being mindful of that. It's a living conversation, and adding to that and removing from it as the team grows and shifts across time is important. So one example of that, if you're running retrospectives and you're coming up with impediments or problems that your teams are experiencing that they can't really solve at their own level, documenting those somewhere so that if nothing else, when new people join the team, they're aware of this is kind of how this place works and the problems that we're experiencing, so they know on day one is very important. And you might come up with other things that are important to your company too. But since you won't have as much of those serendipitous water cooler moments if you're remote without the intentionality that Marcus brought up, documenting what might have been discussed at the water cooler so it's just there for your team can help a lot.
We document everything. And I mean, obviously I'm coming from a company that makes project management and documentation tools, and also is remote, but I would say like the more documentation you have, the easier it is, because it's easier for onboarding new team members. It's easier for continuation if folks leave. And also thinking about, and I'm sure I'll talk about this later, but how you use each type of tool, the type of information that's shared depending on the tool is also really important. For example, we use Confluence internally as sort of a wiki of all of the information that you could ever want at Atlassian. But my team specifically, we have a marketing team resources board that's just specific to our team and is a Trello board. So I know that if I need something that's very specific to my team, I go here, versus something that is more company-wide, I can go there.
One thing I'd add to that, you definitely have to write it down, and documentation is key, but it can become overwhelming over time. And one of the things we did to combat that is when people onboard, we use Trello actually, a bunch of cards. What do you do in your first day? What do you do in your first week? What do you do in your first month, first 3 months? Things like that. And it's generally self-guided, but we say make it better. As you go through the process, when you're learning things, when you run into issues, make it better for the next person that comes in behind you. And doing that has at least dramatically improved the onboarding process. And the same thing really needs to apply to any documentation like that. It tends to atrophy and entropy losses creep in. You've got to keep it up to date and make some minor edits and whatnot. But with a limited investment, it's definitely a high leverage utility for the organization.
There was an interesting question that came in to the panelists in the chat here that said, but that much documentation isn't agile. Just wondering what you all think about that.
Oh, I gotta step in here, even though
Go
I'm
ahead,
a
Johanna.
moderator, because you just took my moderation.
I did.
So it's time to remove stuff, right? If you always add stuff, you are in deep, deep trouble. And David, I actually wanted to take a couple of things in the chat. So we've had questions about working agreements, questions about how much documentation, questions about how to see the work, how to visualize things. This is the ecosystem of the team. And we had one question that came in earlier about management being too in the weeds and how can people monitor the team tasks. So how do you create a team with working agreements? How visible do those working agreements have to be? How do you keep management in the loop? I mean, I think that understanding how to create a virtual team environment so that management is still aware of what's going on. I would love it if you guys could talk about that now.
Well, I could start. It all comes down also to intentionality and documentation. I feel like that's going to be the theme of this panel. But for example, I manage a fairly large team, and I don't want to be a micromanager. So I always tell my direct reports, like, if you feel like I'm micromanaging you, you're probably not giving me enough context. We have a Trello boards for every single project. And what I want to do is I don't want to ping anybody in Slack and distract them asking a question. What I want to do is go on a Trello board or in a Slack channel and get that question answered right away. We also have, for my team specifically, on Friday afternoons, we have a Trello board that's connected to a Slack channel that has, the Trello board has all of a card for every project that is going on. And on Friday afternoons, everyone will update the cards with what's notable that happened that week. And it pipes into a Slack channel so that everybody can see automatically what's going on. So I have some time set aside on Friday afternoons where I can go in and read updates and ask questions or dig into things. When we were smaller, we actually had a full company overview board up until about 100 people, where every team, design, engineering, or every big project had a card, and people would update it, and it would come into a Trello, all Trello channel on Friday afternoons. And that was the way that our CEO and the rest of the management could get updates on what was going on. So I think starting with having some sort of tools that you're using, talking to management about how to set yourself up for success, what their expectations are, and then reporting back on that and making sure to communicate. In remote work, in general, people need to hear something 7 times before they actually internalize it. So I like to tell my team, 7 is a lot. Just give me 3. Assume if I haven't heard something 3 times, I'm probably not going to know it. So it sort of puts the onus on the person to make sure that they're contributing, that they're sharing their updates in different formats. And also, I think that there's, in remote work, for those who are newly remote, there's this idea of having like daily status update meetings or daily meetings to talk, and I hate that. I think that meetings should only be for collaboration and like talking to people. So if there's anything that's like a status update, it should be written. It can be shared over email if your company still uses email. It can be done in Trello, it can be done in Slack, whatever it is. Slack has a number of bots or things you can set up where it'll ask people like, hey, what are you doing today? Or what are your top 3 tasks? I'm sure other folks have other ways of doing it, but that's how we do it.
I think to add another buzzword, which kind of I think encapsulates the documentation is, I mean, transparency. We at Buffer, we do it to an extreme way of like, we also do it to the outside, but I mean, that's what the documentation is, you know, you're documenting things so they're visible to everyone else. And just an example that, because you, Stella, just mentioned, you know, updates, what I've been doing for a while now is kind of like getting all the stakeholders of the mobile team kind of understand what we're doing, right? And there's this weekly update I send out. We use a tool called Threads. We don't use email anymore. And sometimes you don't get people to respond. That's fine. But Threads allows me to see who has seen it, who has caught up on everything. So it's kind of a nice tool that gives me the context, right? And I think remote work is all about the context. It's not, you always hear like over communication isn't a thing. And I've learned that, yes, but it's not about over communication. It's not just about sending it out 100 times. It's about the context that you're sharing. So it's more about like really oversharing in context, everything that you can, right? We all had the Slack messages pop up that say, hey, Johanna, and then you wait. And then they get back to you and say like, yeah, hey, and then you ask, do you have time to chat? You know, like that's not sharing the context. So I think that's very important to think about, not just the communication, but also the context. Instead of just writing, hey, you can write, hey, Johanna, do you have time today at 3 p.m. to talk about this topic? Here's a document, look at it. You know, like that's the context that I mean.
Stella said something interesting, and that was, you know, about making sure if people are poking around. Now, if you've got some obsessive compulsive micromanager, that's a systemic issue, you're probably going to have a really tough time solving that problem. But if management is in the weeds just because they don't feel like what they're getting, it's really on the onus of the organization to figure out what that is through stakeholder engagement. And I think if people understand that, and if you start to, you can start small and chip away at it, but engage the stakeholders, ask them, what do you really need? What's going to make you more comfortable? What's going to help you understand and guide you? And then as soon as they start to get the information that they need on a regular basis, and however you solve that, it could be so specific to the environment. I wouldn't even offer a specific solution, but I think it's one of those things where you get in there and chip away at it. But it's definitely key. The stakeholders need to have the information that they need to operate. And if they don't, and then it starts looking like management getting in the weeds. But the cure is by the people in the organization flowing the right information up and providing that appropriate context. Seven
So
times or
if I
maybe
can,
3.
sorry, if I can summarize a little, teams need to have working agreements so that they understand how to explain where they are. Some of those working agreements might be via a tool where they update the tool on a regular basis. And then managers have to be able to see what's in the tools or see whatever the team produces. And that way you can avoid micromanagement. You cannot avoid middle management, but micromanagement and help the team and serve the team as opposed to press down on the team.
I mean, the focus shouldn't be on the tasks or the specific activities. If you're inquiring about activities, then it just becomes action theater. People aren't necessarily doing the right thing. If you're focusing on the outcomes, which is on a larger, longer time horizon, that's when not only do you focus on the right things and you're really seeing the overall performance, but it's empowering for the team too. You don't care how they do it, you just care that they got the problem solved.
So what we're going through right now is very different, as Stella said, from just remote work. And one of the tips that I give people is we've got to increase empathy 100 times over right now for everyone's situation. So that is well internalized, I think, from team member to team member. But from what I've heard, at least, and the feedback that I've gotten is that it's less well internalized from you to your manager if they're a micromanager. In other words, if they're micromanaging you, you have to understand that if you increase your empathy for them, you might try to understand why. Now, I'm not excusing the micromanagement, but there is probably something going on there that's deeper than their micromanager, that it's on you to try to understand and increase your empathy for that person to dig deeper. One example of that, put yourself in the manager's shoes. You used to be able to see everybody physically all the time, and you might not have been a micromanager previously. It might have just been a physical experience. You were there with everyone in the same space. And now all of a sudden it's out of sight and almost to a certain extent out of mind. And that's scary if you're a manager, if that's new. And so people might react to that in, I need to increase the amount of control, which is not the right response. But from you as a team members, you need to increase your empathy to understand that person's experience and then try to give them the ability to trust you again over time. But again, increase empathy. It's not just from you to other team members, it's you up the chain too.
Somebody
It's
told me.
interesting because,
Go ahead. No,
I'm
go
sorry,
right
I was
ahead.
going to say, it's interesting because, and this is related to, I think, what Linda just said in the chat about trust. Anytime I do any speaking about remote team management, the first question is always, how do you know your people are working when they're remote? And I'm like, how do you know people are working when they're in the office? There's a lot of research that shows that like people actually only work like 2 to 3 hours out of an 8-hour working day in an office setting. And there's research that shows that people are more productive when they're working remotely because they can control their environment. Again, normal remote work, not pandemic crisis remote work. And it is related to trust. I think there are a lot of, it's a very complicated topic that can take a long time, but I think it's a lot about setting expectations and making sure that both the manager and the direct report understand how each of them is going to be successful in the type of information that needs to be shared, what productivity looks like. And then the manager needs to trust the person to actually do their job and have the tools in place to make sure that they can be seeing the results. It's similar to Marcus. We believe in extreme transparency at Trello. And so that is like the biggest gift to a manager is when they can see the work that you're doing. They can see the conversations happening without saying like, hey, Marcus, did you talk to Mike earlier today? It's like, well, I saw they were having a conversation in a channel, so I don't need to ping anybody about that.
And that works also
Sorry,
the other
Mike.
way around, with the manager being very transparent and the people seeing that, you know, maybe sometimes they make a mistake too. Yeah, sorry, Mike, I didn't want to mention anything.
Not a problem. Somebody told me something many years ago, and it really irritated me. I was an individual contributor, and I didn't have a great relationship with my supervisor. And the person told me, you know, your responsibility is to manage that relationship with the boss. And I didn't want to hear any part of that, but over the years, I saw the wisdom in that. I mean, I'm not excusing a boss who's just horrible or anything like that, but the whole point was that the boss has way many more relationships to deal with than you do as an individual contributor. Yes, you need to manage the cross-team relationships and whatnot, obviously, but that's actually been helpful. Again, I'm not excusing bad behavior on the part of the boss or anything like that. I'm just saying that, and I think somebody mentioned, you know, having empathy, putting their themselves in the shoes of the boss is a good thing. And but if you manage that relationship well, everything tends to work. But as was said, it is important for the boss to create the conditions whereby, you know, the individual contributors can be very productive and have what they need.
So if I can go on to the next question, I'm going to bundle a couple of questions again. We've had a couple of questions in the chat about work-life balance. I certainly have opinions about that. And how can you measure what people are doing? We started to answer some of that, and somebody here also mentioned entropy. And I'm not sure if anybody said entropy increases, but especially with children at home, I think the entropy does increase. So the question at hand is, how can we successfully thrive at home in the middle of this pandemic? And how can we do this when we're not in the middle of the crisis, as we start to come out of the crisis, as daycare and school open up? How have you managed that, especially when some people are not available right now, even though they are part of the team? Did that question make sense?
It does. It's a tough one. I don't have a good answer. I don't have the small young age children at home to deal with, but we do have some people that have had that. So early in the process, people came and said, "Hey, we have some individual contributors and other folks that have small children at home. What do we do? Should they just take a bunch of paid time off?" And I said, "No, just try to figure it out. Try to create conditions where you can get some time. If you need to work, shift your hours around so you're working somewhere the kids are in bed. That's fine too." It wasn't without disruption. It's not an optimal environment, but what are you going to do? We didn't have any choice. And I think flexibility on the part of management to allow people to figure out the best ways that they contribute, because these are people that want to do the right thing and want to contribute to the company. They will be very good at figuring out how to solve the problem specific to their own environment, and that's worked well for us. It hasn't been without this disruption, but it's worked well overall.
Yeah, plus one to that, of course, disruption happens, like our productivity, even though we're remote, kind of dropped. But to what you said, Mike, like I had someone in my team too, like 3 little kids at home, and he doesn't have a home office. So every week when we talked, I saw kids flying around. I said it before in the group. And yeah, in that moment, what helps is just empathy, right? Like you can't make them do more what they're already doing. And as you said, like if they want to contribute, they figure out a way. And we figured out a way. Now he's back in his co-working space. And what I like also what Buffer did as a general approach is even to our clients is kind of like a people first approach, right? In this situation where even for the whole of May, we decided to do a 4-day work week. And we've been all loving it because it's really helped kind of our motivation. And, you have 2 days, we had Wednesday off and then 2 days again. So this was a nice experiment even to try, and even, our CEO, Joel, kind of messaging the whole team and talking about this was really helpful to see that leadership by example, whether it's from me as a manager or from the CEO, to kind of share that empathy with the team.
Yeah, leadership by example is so important because, you can say everything that you think, but unless you're doing the actions, then it's not, people don't take it to heart. I think for my team, we talk a lot about mental health. We talk a lot about burnout. I've been the last few months, or I guess actually the start of this year, I started every team meeting just about with a 2 to 3 minute meditation just to get people focused and closing Slack and being able to stop multitasking. But it's hard. I mean, I think we just have to recognize that and recognize that this is an exceptional time and that it's going to pass and things will settle into some sort of a new normal. One thing that I do with my teammates in a regular setting, but also I think would be really helpful in this environment is I have a one-on-one Trello board with each of my direct reports. And in that board, there are the expectations for what the projects are, or I know exactly what people are working on. So they know exactly what my expectations are. And we do that at the beginning of each quarter. We say, like, what are your big projects or priorities this quarter? How can you be successful? And how can I help you be successful as a manager? And I think that's the most important thing is in a time when we do have to be more flexible and people have this added burden and stress at home, if they have the clarity of what it means to be successful at work and you give them the flexibility to accomplish that in their own space and in their own time, then that at least takes away one stressor. And I think that having that ambiguity of not knowing, like, if I'm doing things right, or should I do more, should I do less, like what are the expectations, that causes so much stress for team members. So being really transparent and clear, documenting it, being flexible, these are all things I think are important in a non-pandemic environment, but having a basis of that culturally it really helps when these things happen because you don't have to start making things up as you go along.
So any manager worth their salt or any leader worth their salt would know that if you go through a change process in your organization, productivity will drop. This is true if you're doing a reorg. This is true if you're going through an agile transformation, productivity drops. And so there needs to be a recognition that we're going through a global change process right now where productivity will drop. And that should be expected and well communicated to the company that that is okay and understood, and that leadership is empathetic to the fact that we're all going through this together, and that's the expectation. So that's one. The second thing—
it's probably worth adding that productivity will drop for a brief period, or at least in the short term.
Yeah, exactly, in the short term. Yeah. No,
it's interesting though. I just read a couple of articles. I was surprised to see that for a lot of tech companies, productivity has actually gone up in the last couple of months. I think that that's actually short term because people don't know how to set boundaries with remote work yet. And then the second reason is like, if you're on a sales team now, there's less like traveling going on, like you can just be in Zoom and close more deals. And I think that has driven a lot of tech companies to consider remote work for the longer term, and not just like as a passing thing. But I totally agree with you guys that Mike and David, that productivity in a time of crisis will go down.
Yeah. Before increasing again, to your point, Mike, but in the interim, it goes down. And the other thing to mention there, though, is that if as a leader, instead of worrying about, is this individual working right now, or are they dealing with their kids, or instead you set targets of value creation at either the team level or the company level, and that's what you manage towards, then you care much less, if at all, about how many hours the person's butt in desk. So an example, internally, we set a target to double a particular metric that was very important to us from 20% to 35%, or 40 it ended up at. I didn't care who was working and how many hours they were working towards that goal. I was just caring that that's the goal we set for the company. Did we achieve it or not? So then you let the team self-organize around how do we achieve that metric, right? And that's how you manage in the pandemic, as opposed to worrying about, are you dealing with your kids? How do we increase your hours in the seat? It's just not the right approach in my mind.
I'd argue that that's how you should manage and lead in any situation.
Right. Yeah.
All right. So I wanted to see if I can, so I don't think I heard anything about the work-life balance and boundaries. Stella, you started to talk about boundaries. I would like to actually ask the question, what have you folks done about people who appear to be working too long?
So I'm going to answer in a non-pandemic setting, but it can also be applied in the pandemic setting. But what I think it's very important in a similar sort of mental construct where you have a physical office, you come, you leave. In a digital environment, you have your digital workspace, you come, you leave. So our team, the expectation is that you have set working hours. Obviously, we're flexible. People have doctor's appointments, whatever, but for the most part, you're working the set hours every day. You're coming into an office that we at Trello and Atlassian, we pay for folks in a non-pandemic setting to set up their home office in a similar way that you'd come to an office, you'd expect there to be a desk and a monitor and a screen. We give people that in their home. And my expectation is at the end of the day, you're going to close your laptop and you leave. Our rule is you have to have an office with a door that closes, or not rule, I should say guideline. And I think that really helps. Like, you can't be doing remote work full time, sitting on the couch, sitting on the kitchen island or table or whatever it is. You have to have boundaries between your work and your non-work life. Some people I know like to mimic a commute. They like to take a walk before and after work, listen to a podcast, just to get that transitional frame of mind between going home. So I just think you have to be very, you have to be very self-aware. You have to also have sort of expectations within your team and your group. So we on my team, we have documents where we say, like, here are the expectations for the team. Here are the expectations for when you go on vacation. We don't expect you to have Slack or check your email. Like, we want you to unplug. And being very upfront about all of those things is helps everyone to, because I think the reason why people have this discomfort with work-life balance, they feel like they always have to be on, they feel like people are expecting things, that emails have to be answered right away. But for the most part, like, the email can wait, right? Like, it's not, you'd rather have a person have not be burnt out and have the ability to do their best work when they come to work. So for managers and for the team culture to be very explicit and communicate that, document it, and then we try to repeat it on a quarterly basis, because people will fall into potentially bad habits, or new people will come on and they won't know the expectations. So those are the types of things that we try to do to make sure that people can set the balance that works for them.
That's great advice. That's so key. It's just the subtle things. And people, you need to figure out what's going to work for you. But for those that have been thrust into the work from home suddenly, that's not so obvious. Those are things that's guidance we've, learned and figured out over time, doing it for 8.5 years. But creating a place in your house to the extent you can, that's where you work. And when you're not there, you're not working. That's key. I'd also add that I think the question, Johanna, when you started was, what do you do when people are working too much? There's some other advice that I'd give anybody, whether they're working at home or remotely or in an office, and that is, I ask folks to work at their maximum sustainable pace. Just don't go beyond it. If you go beyond it, you're going to get burned out, and there are going to be problems. If you go less than your max sustainable pace, you're not going to feel like you contributed as much as you could have. So people need to figure that out. It's different for different people. But you combine that with focusing on the outcomes and the results, and not how people are doing it, and everything tends to work out just fine.
That's why I dislike the word sprint in Agile. Sprint to me does not imply sustainable pace. Sprint to me implies the opposite of sustainable pace. And I wish that word were replaced with something like a jog, a stroll.
Yeah, just use iterations. Marcus, did you have anything to add?
Yeah, just a quick thought, just sharing examples. I think also one thing I wanted to mention for a while is we always talk about working from home, which we have to right now, but working remotely doesn't mean you have to work from home and have a home office. There's co-working spaces, buffer pace. We even have a coffee shop stipend. So if you want to work from a coffee shop once in a while, we pay you a certain amount for the coffee, so you're a good citizen. So just mentioning that there's ways to not, work at home, which some people are grateful for. And then one example about the overworking, Katie, who's now the VP, my manager, she did, I think a year or so back, a cool example where, how the Slack indicator, the green light, always tells you if you have Slack open. Sometimes people just have Slack open for other reasons, but what she did as an experiment and showing the leadership of example, she just set it off for the whole time. So that kind of helps with the async communication, with setting expectations, and just in general, letting people know, that it doesn't have to be on. And in the same realm, there was another experiment we did is, if you notice you fall into overwork, we had kind of like a time zone buddy that if he would see you online at that time, or like one person that's, ahead of you, then would tell you, hey, you should be off, kind of, this accountability partner, which sometimes can help.
That's actually, I'll add one more thing that's not obvious until you've been working remotely for a while, is really managing your calendar and managing your time on your calendar. So for people who are needing to do a lot of focus work, I highly recommend blocking out the time in their calendar just for focus time or maker days. We have Tuesdays and Thursdays on my team are maker days where we try not to schedule meetings. Obviously, if you're a manager, you're probably in meetings all the time, so it doesn't apply to you. But I really encourage everyone to take control of their calendar. We share calendars across the team to make scheduling easier, which I think is also a very important thing to do. But one last thing I'll say is I work on normal 9 to 5 Eastern hours. And after 5 o'clock on my calendar, it says, please don't schedule without asking. And I think that's really important for people across different time zones. Otherwise, I'd have folks in Australia scheduling meetings at like 10 p.m. with me, and not really like thinking about it or not really understanding that that's what was going on. So being really explicit in the calendar can be really helpful for having the balance as well.
And Google Calendar even supports that. You can put in your working days, and if someone schedules that, they get automatically declined those events that happen outside of that. So yeah, it's there. We just have to use it.
Automate it.
Yeah. So I want to, we have 5 minutes left. I want to talk about the social niceties. When we're in the office, we get to say hello, how was the football game, whether you're talking about American football or soccer, right? We can talk about our kids. We have the glue that holds us together as social people. How do you guys do that in your distributed remote teams to create that same feeling of connectedness?
Go back to intentionality there. So give some examples. One is we have every Friday a happy hour that's scheduled, and it's completely opt-in. You don't have to be someone who enjoys alcohol either. You can just show up and hang out. And we found that can be slightly awkward if you don't have a prompt question. So we have a list of questions, and someone is responsible every week to come up with an interesting question for the group. And then there's a discussion that usually lasts for 5 minutes before we go off on a different tangent, but it's an intentional space for people to get to know each other better. Another concrete example of that, we have, in the past, we did this little 5-minute plank during the middle of the day. Anyone can get onto Zoom and plank together, the exercise where you're down on your wrists, your hands. Some people could do it for 10 seconds. Some people could do it for 2 minutes. It didn't matter. It was funny. It brought people together. It was a little bit painful. That brought people together, but in a very low impact type of way, right? So being intentional and just taking time to think through what are the things we used to do in person that we can actually still do remotely if we just give a little thought. It can help create those serendipitous moments of connection.
Yeah, I think just to oh, go for it. No, you go, Stella. No, go.
You go. Okay, fine. We have I think it is a cultural thing that you have to, that the leadership establishes and everyone has to pitch in. We say that everyone owns the remote culture. It's not the responsibility of 1 or 2 individuals. Some examples on my team, we do a brunch. We don't do happy hour because apparently brunch is a better thing to do on my team. We do a similar thing. We'll either play games. There's a leader every week. We'll do something fun. We have our lounge Slack channel where every morning people say good morning. We'll share, some people will ask questions on Mondays. I always ask how everyone's weekend was, and people will share photos and talk about what they did. So I think it's just a matter of contributing every single day, having the intentionality, and if you're a manager, making sure that everyone understands that the culture is a shared ownership thing, and people can experiment and do their own things. We definitely have, we have music things, we have Dungeons and Dragons things that people do outside of working hours. We have yoga things. So it really is up to people to contribute. And as a manager, it's good to just keep a pulse on that.
Anything else?
Yeah, just the happy hour aspect. That's a good one. There was a variation of that where we have something called Improvement Day, where every 2 weeks people get a day. It's like 20% time, in our case 10% time, I guess. But during that period, people would just said, hey, we're getting together and talking about inane stuff, whatever it might be. And in a decent sized organization, you always have somebody that's volatile enough to kick something like that off. I think it's similar to the happy hours, that it just creates those points of connection for people. Even the diehard introverts, the ones that don't even look at their shoes when they're talking to you, will join those. Maybe not with video on at first, but it's good stuff.
Okay, so I'm going to wrap this up. Thank you all for your participation on this panel. I am planning to, if I'm allowed, to answer some of the questions in the chat and that we got on my blog. And on behalf of Retrium and the Agile Alliance, thank you all very much for your participation. And all you folks as participants, thank you.